What is going on, you guys? Welcome back. Today, I want to talk about my biggest regret in year one. I was asked this week inside the real estate community that I'm a part of what my biggest regret was. And I had an immediate answer because I've actually thought about this a lot. And that regret is that I prioritized earning over learning. So I want to dive into that today because it's really, really important, especially in real estate, because the downside in real estate if things go wrong is rather significant. But first, if you are new to the channel, my name is Ryan Rice. I'm a full-time real estate investor. I've done over 100 deals in my first few years, have lots of scars that I both want to document for myself so I don't do them again, and so that I can tell you in the event that they are helpful. So the right thing to do is the opposite of what I did. I prioritized earning over learning. What you want to do is prioritize learning over earning. And here is what I mean. In my first year, I set a very arbitrary goal of flipping 10 houses in my first year. And it was so arbitrary because number one, I pulled the number out of nowhere. And number two, what the number was more than anything was just a massage and a feed to my ego if I was able to hit it. And the reason that's a poor goal is because it focuses on an outcome as opposed to what it is that I want to learn about the game of flipping. And by the way, I ended up flipping 3 houses my first year, but I bought 11. And once I bought my 10th, that is what fed my ego enough to be like, oh, I kind of achieved my goal there. And what this goal did is it changed my behaviors. And what I mean is because I knew I wanted to buy at least 10 houses in my first year, my behaviors were very focused on achieving that goal, as opposed to achieving the goal of learning as much as I possibly could. For example, an alternative might have been, okay, I have my first house. How much can I learn about construction? How much can I learn about contractors? How much can I learn about the flow of money? And so what happened, every time there was a situation that came up and I had a decision to make, the decision that I made was wrapped around this end outcome of making sure that I buy 10 houses in my first year. And what that actually led to is I bought some bad deals as a result. Let me give you an example. There was one specific house that I bought, and I decided that I was going to do this massive addition. It was a rancher. I was going to blow the roof off and double its size and was going to do this amazing addition in this great neighborhood. Well, this not only was going to be a very big project, but the home itself was expensive. The purchase price was over $500,000 and it was going to, quote, sell for over $1 million. And that sounded amazing. And honestly, in this neighborhood, that was a likely outcome. This was a very desirable neighborhood. As I moved forward with this plan, however, this, for example, was in an HOA. And because the seller had to sell a home in an HOA, by law, they had to pull the HOA documents and send them to me. And I read through the documents, and there was one little phrase that was in the HOA documents that could be construed as me doing an addition might be a problem. And so I reach out to the head of the HOA, and we have a conversation. And he was a complete dick. He was just not very helpful, and he was very abrasive about the idea of me doing this addition. Now, there was still a path for me to get it approved, but he came across like he really didn't want it done, and I was a little perplexed. Well, what we found out before closing is that he actually offered on the home, and I think it was somehow we found out. And somehow we found out that he was not very happy that he didn't get it. And my offer beat his offer. And so many of us kind of saw this as he was lashing out because he was upset because he didn't get the house. And so while there might have been some sort of chance that I go to do this addition and for some reason it doesn't get approved, which by the way wouldn't have made it a good deal if that would have happened, I chalked it up to, okay, this guy's just pissed. Well, there were one or two other things that happened that just raised the potential for concern. And I remember feeling uneasy about closing. I was actually, while the closing took place, I was actually on vacation in Florida with my family. And I remember just having this uneasy feeling. But what I focused my attention on was the potential upside of this deal. And if I didn't get it, then it meant that I would not be that much closer to the goal that I had set out for myself. And so long story short, I ended up buying it. Now, that deal became a loss for me for a completely different reason. There were no issues with the HOA. I ran into a significant operational issue and ended up not doing the addition. I renovated the house and I sold it, and I sold it at a loss. But I always asked myself that if I didn't have this arbitrary goal of buying 10 houses and was so focused on achieving it to massage my ever so large ego, would I have been more deliberate about the thought process, and would it have been as, quote, painful if I would have just been like, you know what, there are several things here. While it's likely I could still do this big addition, maybe I should just sit this one out because it's not a big deal if I don't get it. And I don't know. I think the likelihood that that would have occurred is at least greater than the likelihood of me being focused on needing to buy 10 houses. And if I didn't buy this house, then it would have prevented me from achieving that goal. And so the thing about these arbitrary goals that we set ourselves for, you know, what I see a lot of students do inside the community, I really want to flip my first house by X amount of months, and I really want to do this by a certain amount of time, or I want to buy 10 houses in my first year. I've heard another student say that. And what I think that those arbitrary goals actually do is they change our behavior in a bad way. They change our behavior in a way that is not productive for ourselves that are 10 years down the line. Because really those types of goals are simply ego driven. They feed nothing else other than making us feel good about ourselves because so-and-so flipped 10 houses in their first year, and because we bought 10, then, you know, that means we're just as good as them. Now, there's nothing wrong with flipping 10 houses your first year, and I think you can approach it the right way. But think about the alternative. If the alternative is that you get violent with how much action that you take, and you don't care how many houses that you do, but you're so violent with the action, and the result of the action that you take is you end up doing 10, and you're so focused on learning that the behaviors are more wrapped around what it is that you're learning and the action that you're taking, as opposed to some arbitrary outcome that you set yourself. That, I think, could be very productive. And so as I've thought through this prioritized learning over earning, there are 3 principles that I came up with that I encourage every new student or every new real estate investor who's getting into flipping to think about. The first thing I tell people is think in decades, not months or years. And if you think in months or even years like I did, then you might be in a rush to accomplish some fictitious goal that you made up. And again, your behaviors are going to be more optimized to whatever ego that you're trying to feed, as opposed to yourself 10 years down the line. If you think, what type of investor do I want to be 10 years from now? And what do I need to do right now that is going to get me closer to that goal? Well, flipping 10 houses in your first year has nothing to do with that, right? If you, for example, don't have a construction background, then you know maybe the first thing that you want to leverage is your construction knowledge. And maybe you can just simply dive in and get really familiar with certain types of construction. Or maybe that's how you prioritize what it is that you're trying to learn. Maybe you have a skill deficiency in sales and the ability to influence people. And so the skill that you want to work on is your ability to influence, and where that comes in handy in flipping is raising money. All right. And so maybe you just want to be super dialed and focused and getting better at talking to people and getting better at soliciting money from people who want to invest and have some extra money on the sidelines. And because you're not focused on some arbitrary amount of houses that you want to flip, then you give yourself time, and you put in violent action because you don't have this flip 10 houses in my first year goal. You still give yourself a violent amount of action to take, but at least your focus and attention is there and it's not wrapped around some outcome. The phrase that I repeat to myself, or that comes to mind, is you're patient with the outcome, but you're impatient with your actions. And if you can think about what type of investor do I want to be 10 years down the road, but you're violent with the amount of action that you're taking now and you continue to be violent for the next 10 years, well, that means the results are naturally going to come, but you're not going to change your behavior based on whether or not you are achieving the result, which I think is important. The second principle is from Uncle Warren, Warren Buffett, and he says the number one rule of investing is don't lose money. The problem with establishing some sort of arbitrary goal is, again, you take action that is optimized for achieving a certain outcome as opposed to what actually may be best for you. And you increase the probability that you lose money if your decisions and your actions are not optimized around learning. There is heavy downside in real estate. If you buy a bad deal, especially if you don't have a lot of money or a lot of reserves in the bank, and you purchase bad, that can be a big problem. The downside could be to the extreme of bankrupt, and I've seen it happen. And so if you can approach your outcomes with patience, then you don't have to worry about doing a certain amount of houses, and you can minimize your downside risk. And maybe what that means, for example, is, okay, I want to buy a certain amount of houses. Oh man, there's this really cheap, 1910 built house. Now it's a full gut rehab and it's a whole lot of stuff, but the numbers look fine, and I'm going to go ahead and do it. Well, you have no construction knowledge. The foundation is crumbling. It is a construction project that's well outside of your league, and it's probably not something that you should take on, right? But you take it on because you're impatient, because you really want a certain outcome, because you really want to get your first house. And then 8 months down the road, you have to fire 3 or 4 contractors, and you're way underwater, and something really bad happens. I see that happen more often than not. And if we can simply focus on the number one rule in investing is don't lose money, then again, you're going to optimize around your learning as opposed to some arbitrary outcome. And the third principle is, in the beginning of real estate, especially if you're flipping, you have significant ignorance debt to pay down. Mainly because flipping is a game of numbers, people, and construction. And a lot of it is construction. And if you don't know much about construction and you get yourself into a very large construction project, then you will pay ignorance debt down very quickly. You will learn very quickly. And if that learning comes at the expense of a bad deal or your own cash, then that can be really painful. And that's why I always encourage newer investors, hey, if you have no construction knowledge and you're getting into flipping, a kitchen, bath, flooring, paint remodel is going to be optimal. And that minimizes your downside because there's less that can go wrong as opposed to if you get into some really old house where you're doing a huge construction project. You also have ignorance debt to pay down. You don't know what a good versus a bad real estate agent looks like. You may not understand that, okay, if I buy a house on this block, well, 2 streets over, it's a little bit different, and you may have to learn that lesson. You may have to learn the lesson of, this house is on a corner lot and it looks good, but right across the street, even though there's a row of trees on the other side of that, there is an interstate, and buyers are going to give a ton of feedback that they can hear the interstate, and therefore most of them aren't going to want to buy that house, and you're going to have to discount it. That is an actual experience that happened to me. And so there's just so many things that you don't know that you will learn very quickly, and you will pay down your ignorance debt, but there's so much to pay down that it's better to minimize your downside than to optimize your actions and your behaviors around some arbitrary goal that you've set for yourself. And I think what's great about this concept, even if you are made it to the end and you're listening to this and you're not flipping houses, prioritizing learning over earning, I think, can be applied to anything. And it's something I constantly think about in everything that I can do. Mainly because the only time you would do the reverse is if you're feeding your ego. And so there you have it. That is probably my biggest learning of my first year flipping. And since I was asked the question and I talked about it, I figured I would make this for you guys and tell the story, because if that can benefit you and save you from some long-term pain. And again, if you're prioritizing actions around a short-term goal, that might feel good in the moment, but then it's going to create long-term pain because you're going to have so much ignorance debt to pay down and stuff can go wrong. And so prioritizing the short-term pain of being patient, not with your actions, but with the outcomes, and that is going to maximize and help prioritize your long-term gain. So short-term pain for long-term gain, as opposed to the reverse, where if you have some arbitrary amount of houses, you're going to prioritize short-term gain, which is the ego that you're feeding yourself. Yeah, I bought 10 houses, and then you're going to have long-term pain because you're going to have to learn things the hard way. So I hope that was helpful. If you know someone who is just starting or this message might be helpful, send this to them. Maybe together we can prevent people from getting themselves into trouble. And I bet whoever you send it to would be appreciative of that. So, and that is the only way that this podcast grows is by you guys sharing it. So I appreciate those of you who are. And for those of you who are new, if you could share it, that would mean a lot to me. So hope you guys enjoyed that. I will see you in the next one. Bye.